When there is an issue that seems to unite people from the left and the right, sometimes it's worth reflecting whether it is the right issue to unite behind. Today, perhaps more than ever, voices calling for more regulation of social media and big tech platforms are becoming louder. It's not surprising that an interventionist approach is coming from the populist left.
Oh, the idea that any of these giant social media platforms, which are effective monopolies, the idea that YouTube or Facebook or Twitter can just willy-nilly decide, yeah, we're going to pull down whoever we want for whatever reason we want because something vague terms of service, the principle of that thing is the problem. So what's the real solution? The real solution is that all of these different outlets should be regulated as public utilities. This is now regulated as a public utility, so the First Amendment applies.
But this message seems to resonate in the right-wing circles and begins to reach mainstream maybe even faster on the right than on the left.
Since it has the power to censor the internet, Google should be regulated like the public utility it is, to make sure it doesn't further distort the free flow of information.
But what would it mean to regulate social media as public utilities? Would it guarantee that the internet would be more free and open? Public utility usually refers to an essential service or an organization providing that service to the general public. The key word here is essential because not just any service can be defined as a public utility. Essential services are usually very basic, like building pipelines for water and natural gas or laying electric and telephone wires. In many cases, it is just the bare infrastructure that's considered a public utility, while the services themselves can be open to competition of providers using the same public infrastructure. Sometimes, internet can be considered a public utility, but more often it's the backbone, telephone or cable infrastructure that's considered a public utility. Internet service providers are then allowed equal access to this infrastructure to offer internet access service to homes and businesses. But in the United States, the internet is not considered an essential service. Internet is defined as an information service that is built on top of the basic telecommunications services. This comes back to the net neutrality debate, which has been challenging the Federal Communications Commission since 1970s. The FCC regulates what makes up the internet of today on 3 levels: as telecommunication services, information services, and edge providers. Telecommunication services classify companies that provide basic infrastructure: telephone pipes, cable TV, or fiber optic cables. The US doesn't have a big competition of telecom providers, and they are usually provided as monopolies by AT&T or Comcast. Information services then use this backbone telecom infrastructure. Internet service providers fall under this category, and it is usually a more competitive market. However, in the United States, internet service providers are oftentimes the same companies that offer telecommunications infrastructure, and thus they use their dominant position in the telecommunications market to bar entry of new providers to internet service market. Net neutrality order by the FCC in 2015 was supposed to classify internet service providers as telecommunication services and thus regulate them as public utilities. That effort was repealed by the FCC in a 3-2 vote last year. The third level of the internet is comprised of edge providers. This can be anyone who builds a website or an app or provides any service through internet access. Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, Facebook, Reddit, TechCrunch, Steam, TikTok. These are all edge providers. Edge providers have thus far remained relatively untouched by the FCC regulations, and it has its reason: cost. The cost of entering the market of edge providers by building a website or an app is significantly lower than the ISP or telecommunication markets. Google, despite dominating the online search, has a plethora of alternatives: Ecosia, Startpage, DuckDuckGo, Quant, Cirx, just to name a few. Some alternatives are harder to find than others, and sometimes substitutes are the only choice for consumers. But the fact of the matter is, You can compete with Google without investing millions into materials and labor and requesting government permits from local municipalities to dig through roads like you would have to if you wanted to become an internet service or telecommunications provider. That being said, companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple do enjoy very dominant positions, and they do abuse their power. Google has been long extremely anti-competitive, as it's been artificially giving its own services higher ranks in the search results than their competition. Similar can be said about Apple, but to some people, unfortunately, this is considered a feature rather than an evidence of power abuse. Facebook and Twitter have been recently purging hundreds of alternative and independent media with millions of followers from their platforms. This, along with fake news and foreign interference, is being cited by critics from both the left and the right as evidence that big tech has grown too big and too influential in the social and political discourse in modern society. And they are not wrong. We allowed these corporations to monitor our everyday activities, study our psychologies, and develop tools and products that are most responsive to our emotional states. This is not a conspiracy theory. Silicon Valley corporations have slowly morphed from technology firms into advertising networks. We've actually seen less innovation in tech and more development in big data analysis and mass surveillance. Advertising industry is growing bigger than ever, and it wouldn't be the case if digital marketing didn't work. Anything you see on these social media can be just a part of another marketing campaign. Google manipulates search, Facebook and Twitter filter and tweak feeds, and people's entire businesses can be destroyed overnight because of coordinated measures to ban them from these platforms. We need to be honest with ourselves and acknowledge that this is a very dystopian world to live in. It's not just a distant future, we already live in this dystopia. Something needs to be done, but is that something in public utility regulations? Internet-enabled services aren't just easier to compete with on the side of edge providers, but users can easily make their choice too. If you can't find an alternative to what you're looking for, you can always at least find a substitute. If you don't like Facebook, you can communicate through Signal messaging app or migrate to Minds. If you don't want to use Google, DuckDuckGo or StartPage are just a click away. Tired of Gmail reading your emails for ads? ProtonMail and Tutanoda are open for business. Got your nudes leaked from iCloud? Try to encrypt your files with Nextcloud. It might be challenging to convince your friends and family or a whole business to switch, and some services like YouTube are too costly to replace. But is this enough reason to classify YouTube as a public utility? In the history of the internet, no matter how big a service becomes, it doesn't tend to age very well. There were times when AOL used to dominate the internet, only to be replaced by Yahoo when both of them got eventually acquired by Verizon. MySpace and Friendster, once huge, were replaced by a college dorm room project. Google Plus was supposed to mean something, but it was completely ignored by probably everyone on Earth. Are big tech firms monopolies? Well, it looks like they are artificially trying to form monopolies, but they are certainly not natural monopolies. Natural monopolies are usually providing that backbone infrastructure where it is actually cheaper to have just one provider of gas pipelines than having multiple pipes from several companies going into each house. Internet firms aren't like that. Their services are not tied to any geographical location. The internet market is the whole globe. Anyone from anywhere in the world, from almost any background, can compete with them. If Facebook, Google, Apple, and the rest of the big tech become regulated as public utilities in the United States, they would essentially lock in their positions as local monopolies, making it harder for new technologies to replace them. Social media platforms have been so prevalent in our societies only for about a decade. Their success largely depended on the outbreak of smartphones and mobile devices. But that too is starting to become old and unexciting. The input-output constraint is going to be a huge barrier to our current devices we use every day when technology advances in the future. Using two thumbs on a screen is going to have to be replaced by something else. Internet is a decentralized network. Anybody can join and leave the game at any time. Rules are constantly changing, and the game never ends. The problem arises when the top players start writing the rules that benefit them and hurt the rest. The big tech needs to be investigated for anti-competitive practices instead to allow more competition of edge providers. They wouldn't be able to censor free speech if people were using a more diverse range of services. But I don't blame consumers for this. If you are aware of these problems, you can switch already. But the big tech's interference artificially censors competition from internet users. If Google wasn't manipulating search results to favor their own services and de-rank their competition, if Apple wasn't waging patent wars against competing providers, if Amazon wasn't pricing out book retailers only to dominate the publishing industry, we wouldn't have these problems today. When the government fails to protect fair game and is implicit in preferential treatment, is it reasonable to turn to the same government to make a change? If you don't like centralized corporations offering you centralized services, is it reasonable to expect from a centralized government to bring about any meaningful change? Some might say that the government is accountable to its electorate and corporations are accountable to their shareholders. True, but that doesn't apply to a political system where corporations are allowed to pour hundreds of millions of dollars annually to write laws that favor them and harm you.
What do you think Washington doesn't understand?
I would invert the question by saying the average American doesn't realize how much the laws are written by lobbyists. And that is, and I'm not trying to offend anyone who might be of that like here, and it's shocking now, having spent a fair amount of time inside the system, how the system actually works. And it's obvious that if the system is organized around incumbencies writing the laws, the incumbencies will benefit from the laws that are written.
And finally, regulating social media as public utilities might make more sense in the United States than anywhere else in the world because of the First Amendment. But not even people in the United States are settled on what is and isn't free speech. Would conservatives be in favor of monopolizing the internet content if they weren't in power as they are now? The point is that it is a lot safer to vote with your wallet, or more specifically with your data, and switch to alternatives and substitutes that are more aligned with your values and ethics, than to call for help from the government bought out by the very same corporations you want to oppose. So instead of relying on the system riddled with pay-to-play corruption to fix itself, it's time for the people to enforce change. The future of the internet lies in decentralization. It is possible to make that switch now. I don't use any Google service outside of YouTube at all. I use DuckDuckGo for search, ProtonMail for email, and Nextcloud for cloud storage. I have no Facebook, Instagram, and I don't even use my Twitter account that much. I hate Windows and I can't stand macOS, so I edit my videos on GNU Linux. I communicate with my closest friends over Signal messaging app, and if I need to get anything done, I always find free and open source software for it.
Every time we give them this duty, we're also giving them more power. We're telling them, we think you, Facebook, should decide how to run the culture. And even if in each case, what we're saying is absolutely defensible and absolutely beyond dispute in that case, cumulatively, we're asking them to take more and more power over the culture. Now remember, Facebook is owned and controlled by one person, even though it's a public company, so who knows who's going to inherit it? What if Vladimir Putin inherits it and then we've given it all this power? As we're trying to fix these problems by petitioning the big Silicon Valley companies, we're also concentrating their authority implicitly, and I think we're setting ourselves up for even worse problems in the future. So, this notion that we're depending on these centralized sources is crazy. I mean, would you it becomes similar to state media at that point.